explores the theme of gender, family, madness, religion, and etymology between 1690 and 1720. And as part of her project, she hopes to create a publicly accessible interactive digital network map of Glanville's social circle. So we're looking forward to that. Um, Michelle has received a number of prestigious fellowships, including a Kolb Research Fellowship from the American Society for 18th Century Studies, a research fellowship from the Linda Hall Library, and a Gladys Kriebel Delmont's Foundation Fellowship. And she just won a Bibliographical Society of America Research Fellowship, so congratulations for that. In addition, she's won an award for creative writing and has curated exhibitions at Binghamton University Art Museum. It's thus my great pleasure to introduce Michelle to give her talk, In Pursuit of Butterflies, Eleanor Glanville and the Culture of Collecting Insects. So Michelle, I'll leave it to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Anna Marie, for that introduction. I'm very excited today to share with you my lecture on Eleanor Glanville, the early 18th century entomologist. And here, we'll share my screen. So I want to thank Professor Anna Marie Roos for connecting me to the Eleanor Glanville Institute and the director, Belinda Colston, for kindly extending the invitation to present today. I also want to thank Joy Knight and Layla Lamoureux for helping to organize the event. So I'll open with a story of one night in 1702, just a few days after Christmas, when the gentlewoman Eleanor Glanville sent a box of 100 butterflies to her correspondent, the apothecary and naturalist James Pettiver, a fellow of the Royal Society. She carefully filled a large wooden crate with extra cotton to prevent jostling the delicate butterfly wings as the specimens traveled the road from Bristol to London by wagon. Oh no, oh, there we go. Had trouble switching the slide there for a second. So on the road from Bristol to London by wagon, Pettiver himself would select a few of the rarest butterflies from that box to include in his printed catalog, where he applauded Madame Glanville's keen eye for rare and new insects. And one of the insects in that box, the Lincolnshire fritillary, would come to be known as the Glanville fritillary, which is the name by which the butterfly is known to this day, right? The species name is Militea sphinxia. And so it's this butterfly, the Glanville fritillary, by which Eleanor Glanville is best remembered, right? But the basic contours of Glanville's life and her broader impact on the history of entomology remains little known and underexplored. In the first decade of the 18th century, Glanville carved out a space for herself as an impressive collector of rare butterflies amongst London naturalists. Her collecting activities stretched beyond London to the moorlands of her Somerset estate, where she ambled through marshes and along the coast searching for unique specimens. And she gained renown as a collector of Southwest butterflies in particular, but her efforts to collect across the Atlantic remained unacknowledged in her time and in our own. The Atlantic port city of Bristol, which lay only 10 miles from Glanville's home, actually afforded her opportunities to collect exotic butterflies from colonial outposts. After her death in 1709, her disinherited children attempted to overturn her will on the grounds of insanity, in part because she studied butterflies. So today, during this lecture, I'll bring into focus some of the basic contours of Eleanor Glanville's life, who she was, what she did, and why it's important that we know about her. And I'll tell her story roughly chronologically in 4 main periods: her birth and her childhood, her marriages and family life, the period in which we know that she collected insects, and her legacy after her death, especially immediately following her death. The goal today is to offer a brief biography of Eleanor Glanville, to provide an overview of her life, And it's a little bit more narrative driven, less interpretive than some of my work, but I want you all to walk away with the sense of Eleanor Glanville, a sense of the historical period that she occupied, and also a sense of the particular opportunities and challenges that she faced within that time as one of the few women entomologists. Before we dive in, though, I want to say a few words about my sources and my approach to historical sources. Because Glanville's documentary record is fragmentary, at least compared to her male counterparts and other aristocratic women in the period who studied natural history. As you might imagine, women didn't exactly fare well in the historical record at this time. So retelling the story of Glanville's life requires something of a more creative approach to the archive, right? So sometimes this entails stretching the scattered fragments of her life, gleaning as much meaning as I can from these documents and materials. Sometimes it means approaching her obliquely through her male family members, friends, and neighbors, about who many more documents survive. Mostly, though, it means imagining Glanville's story as a kind of pictorial negative space, the outlines of which only come into focus by painting these surrounding features. And that's really how I framed my dissertation and this talk, right? So really trying to understand that historical period she occupied and the particular challenges that she faced as a woman. I should also mention, before I really get started, that throughout this talk, I'll refer to Eleanor Glanville as Glanville, simply, or Eleanor Glanville. She had a few surnames throughout her lifetime. She was born Eleanor Goodrich, became Eleanor Ashfield upon her first marriage, and Eleanor Glanville upon her second. And just for the sake of clarity, I consistently refer to her as Glanville for a number of reasons, but most importantly, because that's the name by which she was and is best known. So Eleanor Glanville was born circa 1655 to Major William Goodrich and Eleanor Poyntz. Glanville's father came from a wealthy family in Yorkshire, the Goodrichs of Ripston Hall, while Glanville's mother, Eleanor Poyntz, had descended from the wealthy Davies family in Somerset. And her mother, Eleanor Poyntz, had inherited a large portion of lands there, including Tickenham Court, which would be Eleanor Glanville's home for most of her life. It's an old medieval structure. There's some pictures here that I took this past summer. And it has these really spare limestone walls and beautiful 14th century arch braced ceilings. And it still actually stands today as a working farm. It really is a beautiful building. So around age 11, both of Glanville's parents had died, leaving her sole heir of a vast estate. And altogether, she owned approximately 1,300 acres of land in Somerset, spread out across the parishes of Clevedon, Cheddar, Backwell, Rodney Stoke, and Tickenham. So the lands, you can see on this map, I have starred Bristol. So in between Bristol and Clevedon is where most of her estates were, where she had 1,300 acres. And here I want to point out that more than half of her holdings were meadows and moorlands, so lands that regularly flooded. And it's these marshy wetlands that fostered biodiversity in the region, providing a kind of ideal habitat for butterflies. And it's possible that growing up here may have encouraged in Glanville a kind of curiosity and interest in the natural world, right? It's not difficult to imagine. We can't really say that for sure, though, because we don't actually really know all that much about Glanville's childhood, her education, or when she began studying butterflies. Only in 1701 do we have concrete evidence that she even collected butterflies. It's likely that she did beforehand, but we just don't know exactly when that started. So based on her gender and class, however, we can make some inferences about her education, right? So Glanville belonged to the gentry, an elite landowning class that, although wealthy, was not aristocratic. She would have been tutored in subjects such as reading, writing, basic arithmetic, maybe even French, we're not really sure, but it was, on the curriculum. And And since she was orphaned at 11, it's likely that she lived with a guardian or went to some sort of boarding school, where she would have also learned basic household management skills such as needlework, preparation of foods and medicines, gardening, and perhaps even sericulture, the raising of silkworms. There's actually a mulberry tree about 30 yards from her home, Tickenham Court. Only the stump exists today, but at one point it was a very large mulberry tree. And she also would have been the exact age when intricate embroidery came into vogue for young girls. The scholar Mary M. Brooks has argued that this kind of embroidery can be understood as performing domestic curiosity. So, and insects were a really popular motif in a lot of these embroideries. This isn't a chest created by Glanville, but it is, a casket created by a young girl who would have been around Glanville's age at the time. And so we don't really know, but it's entirely appropriate for a girl of Glanville's age and social class to have engaged in domestic work like this. So when Glanville was 21, she married the portraitist Edmund Ashfield in 1676 in London. And it's likely that they met there, where Glanville had relatives and Ashfield had been working as a portraitist. And here's some of his portraits. Edmund Ashfield was born in Little Missenden, Buckinghamshire in 1640 to Catherine and Hampton Ashfield. Now, this branch of the Ashfields was distantly related to the Ashfields of Lincolnshire, but Edmund himself did not come from Lincolnshire. And it seems to have been something of a love marriage, much to the chagrin of Glanville's family, who complained that he was a person very unequal to her in fortune and circumstance, and with whom she married without advice of her friends and relations. And they also complained that he had no visible estate of his own. Nevertheless, by all accounts, the marriage was a happy one. They moved from London back to Glanville's country estate, Tickenham Court in Somerset. They had 2 children, Forrest Ashfield and Mary Ashfield. Unfortunately, though, their marriage was very short because Edmund Ashfield died in 1679, just 3 years after they were married. And so Glanville was widowed with 2 small children by age 24. She remarried in 1685 to Richard Glanville, a gentleman descended from a family in Elmstead, Suffolk. And at the time of the marriage, Eleanor had an annual income of about £600. And just for your perspective, you were considered immensely wealthy if you had above £200 per annum. So £600 was a considerable sum of money. And in the early years of their marriage, Richard worked at the Bristol Customs House as a cashier. And it's likely that the two met in this growing commercial port city. My research at this stage is still in the early stages, but it indicates that Richard's position at the Customs House, which is a site where all incoming ships from abroad would need to pass through, may have afforded Eleanor Glanville access to exotic specimens from abroad. Although I don't really have enough evidence to assert that just yet. But I do know that the naturalist William Cole, who was a correspondent to Robert Southwell, the 9th president of the Royal Society, that he also worked at the Bristol Customs House under the same collector as Richard Glanville, so they were colleagues. So it's possible these are all kind of like tantalizing clues that I'm investigating. I just wanted to share with you a little bit about that. It's possible that the Customs House was a site for collecting curiosities. In any case, Richard's time at the Customs House was pretty short. He and Eleanor had 2 children together, Richard Glanville Jr. and Eleanor Glanville Jr. in 1687 and 1688, respectively. And again, the family lived together at Tickenham Court for above 10 years. Right, but the family did have a lot of contacts in Bristol and traveled to Bristol quite often. In contrast to Eleanor's first marriage, her second marriage to Richard was extremely volatile. Richard committed extreme physical violence against Eleanor, and it was really extreme even by the standards of the day, right? It shows up in court cases, which is, that means that it really was exceptional. And according to these court records, Richard's violence against Eleanor stemmed from a unique marriage contract that they drew up in 1685, and it was a marriage contract that he had willingly agreed to. Just some background, usually in English common law and custom, when a woman married, she effectively relinquished control of her assets to her husband, which was a legal status known as femme couvert, meaning, she's legally covered by her husband. At the time of Richard and Eleanor's marriage, however, Eleanor, with the help of her family, circumvented this status by putting her assets in a trust. So even though she was married, she retained the legal capacity to act as a femme sole, basically meaning single woman. And it was a status typically reserved for widows. Their unique marriage arrangement, again, one that Richard had initially agreed to, afforded Eleanor, as a married woman, an unusual amount of control over her estates and her finances. And Richard evidently despised this arrangement, and he resorted to brutal violence to get control of Eleanor's assets for a number of years. And the couple officially separated in 1698, around then, but Eleanor lived in constant fear of his return until her death in 1709. Okay, so far I've covered Glanville's life from her birth through her two marriages, roughly the period 1655 to 1698. And I want to stress that throughout this period, we don't really know anything about her study of collecting insects. Again, the earliest we could date her collecting insects is 1701, when a butterfly of hers, the hair streak Calophyris ruby, was added last minute to some copperplate engravings being prepared for one of James Pettiver's printed catalogs. And it's in James Pettiver's archive that we actually find the most detailed evidence of Glanville's contributions to entomology. We learn that Glanville was not merely a collector of insects, but also an astute and skilled entomologist who studied insect morphology and life cycles, that she carefully distinguished between different species, recorded her own observations in multiple notebooks, and that she researched the insects that she was studying in entomological reference works. And we also learned that she collected butterflies both locally and from abroad. First, though, before we get into some of the sources that survive of Glanville's, I want to provide some context as to why and how she appears in James Pettiver's archive. Pettiver was arguably one of the most famous collectors in his own day. And between 1609 and his death in 1718, this apothecary and naturalist developed a robust collection of all manners of natural curiosities, plants, mosses, shells, lizards, snakes, insects. And it was a really massive collection for the time. It came with a massive amount of paperwork and a massive network of correspondence to sustain this collection. Of course, during this time, many collectors did go out into the field to collect specimens themselves, but serious collectors cultivated relationships with other collectors in other regions with whom to exchange specimens. And Pettiver did just that. He developed an impressively large correspondence network of at least 289 individuals, only 11 of whom, including Eleanor Glanville, were women. So at the British Library, amidst literally thousands of letters, only 2 letters and 1 list of observations survive in Glanville's own hand. And I want to stress that this collection has been curated over the centuries. So this is really just what survives. I really do think that there was more at one period in time. The first letter is dated from Bristol, and I have it pictured here. It's dated December 28th, 1702. And it's clear from the letter that this is not their first exchange. Glanville sent it to Pettiver ahead of a shipment of 100 moths and butterflies that she was sending him. The little anecdote that I opened the lecture with. The letter contains some basic elements of letter writing at the time, a kind of feigned modesty and humility, right? Glanville wishes she could send finer insects, but hopes he accepts some of them as particularly new or interesting. She hopes that they're worthy, right? But interestingly, Glanville also asks Pettifer to send her the Latin and common name of specimens. Now, I want to note that this was 30 years before Linnaeus's binomial taxonomy that we still use today, right? Genus, species, where a species name is only 2 words. In Glanville's time, naturalists were still in the process of figuring out how to name species, what system to use, how to talk about species, when there was no universal, no mutually agreed upon names for them. And finding out the Latin names required studying Latin texts, and Glanville, as a woman, did not have the opportunity to study Latin like her male peers. And so this is one really important challenge that women faced as naturalists at this time, right? Not knowing Latin was a challenge for women and for men, right? So there are some men in this time who don't know Latin either. But nevertheless, non-Latin naturalists were able to contribute to natural history, specifically in the process of differentiating between species. And so this brings us to the list of Glanville's observations that survive in Pettifer's archive, titled, "This is what I know of those I send you." And so Glanville in this list assigns each specimen a number, which is a common strategy for communicating about insects when one could not ascertain the name. But to even assign it a number, though, Glanville needed to make distinctions between different species and recognize sexual differences within species. And so this process of sorting out specimens, of differentiating between species, was a really important first step towards systematizing nature's abundant diversity. Now, Pettifer, when he received the specimens, would take the next step by assigning them names, both Latin and common. Part of distinguishing between species entailed recording the insect's life cycle. To study insect metamorphosis seems obvious to us now, but Glanville studied insects during a time when the concept was relatively new. Before the 1660s, it was commonly believed that insect life cycles were not life cycles at all, but the birth and death of new organisms altogether. So a caterpillar was one organism which died and gave rise to a pupa, which died and gave rise to an adult butterfly, and so on. But beginning in the 1660s, the Dutch entomologist Johannes Godart published his volumes Metamorphosis Naturalis, which observed a single organism as it transformed through its various life stages. And Glanville was, as the list of observations attest, familiar with Godart's work. Although initially written in Dutch and Latin, the English naturalist Martin Lister had translated, expanded, and reorganized Godart's Of Insects into English in 1682, complete with new engravings. And Glanville clearly owned this book. She actually makes direct reference to Lister's translation in her observation, attempting to communicate to Pettifer what a specimen's chrysalis looked like. She actually boldly corrects a mistake in the printed record, writing the coffin, and coffin meaning the cocoon, was in form like Dr. Lister's number 3. That next the butterfly, which take notice, is in his book wrong placed, for both the worm and coffin belongs rather to his number 4, your admiral, for I have seen its change. So she's actually really critical of Lister's work, remarking that the specimens are not well figured. And you kind of sense this frustration that she has, right? She really only has access to English language books, this time when a vast majority of scientific works and reference works were written in Latin. I want to pause here to kind of acknowledge what a bold critique this is to make in a document that she was sending to James Pettifer, who was closely associated with Martin Lister, a fellow of the Royal Society, and a naturalist that Dr. Anne-Marie Roos has written about extensively. And I'm sure she could tell you more about him than I can. But so yeah, it's kind of a really bold critique that she's making, and she's trusting her own visual witness over that of Godard. And in both her letter and list of observations, through the feigned humility, she actually conveys a really strong sense of confidence and knowledge about insects, specifically like how she witnesses the insects' life cycles. Now, Glanville could exhibit all the confidence that she wanted, but the question arises: would she be taken seriously by other naturalists? And according to Pettiver's manuscripts and printed catalogs, it seems that he did take her moderately seriously. Um, in his inventories, he kept track of the specimens that Glanville sent, and in some cases, even exerted some of her observations in his notes. Their relationship lasted until at least 1704, so it's really a small window of time, 1701 to 1704. And it was in this year, on March 6th, that Pettiver actually took on Glanville's youngest son as an apprentice in his apothecary shop. And we know that Pettiver actually was loath to take on apprentices. He often refused people. So we might see this relationship as a gesture of friendship. Right. So at least at one point, even though they corresponded, she was one of 289 correspondents, it does seem that they met in person, and that they did have some sort of correspondent relationship. And as we've already seen, Pettiver even selected a few of her specimens to appear in his Gazophylaceae Naturae, a printed catalog of his collection. There's been a lot of scholarship lately on Pettiver's catalogs, right? He printed these catalogs with these really, I think, crudely engraved plates and specimens that kind of look like they have googly eyes for his own record-keeping purposes. But Pettiver was not exceptionally wealthy, and he couldn't afford to offer monetary compensation for the specimens that he received from his correspondents, at least not, all of them. What he could do for his correspondence, and what he did, was to have their names recognized in his printed catalogs, right? So there's some kind of social credit that goes along with these exchanges. And he did just that for Glanville. He recorded her contributions to his collections, emphasizing the rarity of the specimens that she sent. So in this example, this and figure 11, all very rare, were first discovered in the west of England by Madame Glanville, a person extremely curious in the knowledge of English insects. Here we have the Lincolnshire fritillary, first observed there and given me by Madame Glanville. And another example of Glanville being the first person I received it from who observed it. These are just some examples. There's a few more. But in most of the examples, Pettiver highlights just how rare the specimens that Glanville sent are. And indeed, there were several specimens that Glanville found that are the earliest recorded findings of these species, including the Lincolnshire fritillary, after which she's named. But I want to be careful not to reduce her career to the one insect after which she's named, because her contributions were much broader than this. Amongst other naturalists, she gained a reputation as an impressive collector of English butterflies, and particularly butterflies from the southwest region of England. The naturalist William Vernon once remarked, "On Holborn Hill by chance, a lady came to town with the noblest collection of butterflies, all English, which has shamed us." And Glanville's renown as a collector of intensely regional butterflies was part of a larger trend towards more local natural histories. Paradoxically, the influx of specimens from colonial ventures from the Americas, Asia, and Africa prompted many Europeans to look anew at their own environments and find diversity within. The scholar Alex Cooper has written a lot about this kind of inventing the indigenous. And in England, this turn towards cataloging local diversity specifically tied to an emerging sense of British national identity. So while naturalists did marvel at exotic species from abroad, they also came to value intensely local specimens. Now, the Somerset levels that surrounded Glanville's home in Tickenham Court was and is a unique ecosystem for wildlife. The area was filled with marshes, meadows, and moorlands. And in Glanville's lifetime, there were some man-made efforts to drain the lands, but it wasn't until the late 18th century that the area was really systematically drained. Glanville herself, as a reminder, owned approximately 233 acres of meadows and 500 acres of moors, which regularly flooded in the winter. And this unique environment hosted a broad diversity of flora and fauna. Glanville collected some of the rare butterflies there unique to the south of England, including the silver-washed fritillary and the wood-white butterfly. So you might ask, how did Glanville collect her specimens? Well, for the local ones, she actually went out into the land surrounding her home and collected worms, caterpillars, and butterflies herself. She also employed her apprentice girls and servants to collect specimens, often offering them payment. And in this way, she amassed an impressive collection of specifically Southwest butterflies. No inventory of her collection exists, but we can estimate, based on available records, that she had at least a couple of hundred different species. And again, this is how Glanville was recognized by her community of naturalists, as a collector of English insects. But a deeper look into Glanville's documentary and material record, however, reveals that she had ambition to become a collector of exotic rarities too. She actively sought to establish correspondents in the Americas who would collect butterflies and moths on her behalf. In her 1702 letter to Pettifer, she writes, "I am just now making interest with a young gentlewoman that is going to her friends in Virginia, and also a man of my acquaintance, which is going with the fleet, and 2 doctors of ships. All this will not fail me, for they promise to send me some fine insects." Now, cultivating correspondence in distant locales was crucial to becoming a collector. Pettifer did it, the Royal Society did it, everyone who was anyone in the collecting scene did it. And Glanville's proximity to the Atlantic port city of Bristol, as I've mentioned earlier, afforded her access to all manner of people traveling to the Americas, Caribbean, and Africa. And a lot of my research recently is geared towards these local connections that Glanville had with merchants in Bristol. Now, of course, the letter only hints at her efforts to collect abroad, right? We don't have any follow-up correspondence or any documentary confirmation that she did, in fact, collect abroad. Fortunately, though, there's just one 320-year-old specimen held at the Natural History Museum provides some pretty convincing evidence that she did succeed in her efforts. So this specimen, again, it's 320 years old, is the Batis philanor, or pipevine swallowtail. And it's a species that is native only to the Americas. And here you could see on the bottom label, in James Pettifer's cramped handwriting, a reference to his own catalogs and the source of this particular specimen, Glanville, right? So spelling wasn't standardized in the period, you might have noticed so far. So Glanville, right, referring to Eleanor Glanville. And this insect artifact, as I call it, strongly suggests that Glanville did in fact collect specimens from abroad, and she did establish contacts in the Americas, all in an effort to expand her collection. Now, her sources for collecting illustrates, I argue, one key precondition to her scientific activity, despite her gender, and this is her strategic location near the Somerset levels and its proximity to Bristol, right, which enabled her to collect both intensely local specimens and Atlantic ones too. She relied on her wealth and the leisure time afforded to her by her status to collect local specimens, and it seems that she leveraged her social connections in Bristol to collect specimens from abroad. Now, I'm not really sure why Glanville never gained recognition in her efforts to collect across the Atlantic, or why she's remembered as a collector of chiefly English insects. But again, just because she wasn't recognized in her own time for this doesn't mean that we should neglect her efforts now. And her reliance on Atlantic specimens, I argue, speaks to the role that empire played in facilitating insect collecting for women too, right? It was a technology, empire was a technology that they had access to in this period, as Eleanor Glanville's case demonstrates. In scholarship on the history of women in science in the early modern period, a predominant narrative contends that family life often functioned as a mechanism or avenue to women's engagement with scientific work. So it is, behind prominent male scientists were wives, daughters, sisters, cousins who made important contributions to their work. And I'm finding that Glanville is unique precisely because she had no immediate male family member to introduce her into learned communities. And when she emerged as a collector amongst London naturalists in 1701, she'd already been separated from her husband for 2 years. She was about 46 years old, with 4 children, the youngest of which was age 13, and she had no father, no husband or brother to oversee or endorse her work, right? So I think it's this factor, her relative, and I stress relative, independence from kind of close male authority or protection that made her the subject of derision amongst her children, neighbors, and tenants. And it is from those closest to her that she faced the most severe obstacles to her scientific activity. Now, Eleanor Glanville died in London in 1709 of causes that we don't know. By the time of her death, Glanville had written all 4 children out of her will, leaving her vast estate to a distant cousin. I can't pinpoint the exact reason why this is, right? There's a mess of court documents and testimonies that present a lot of conflicting evidence. Forrest claimed that, her son, her eldest son, claimed that he had been disowned for a number of reasons, that he had turned Protestant while his mother was Catholic, and she was in fact Catholic for a long time, and that she was out of her senses when she wrote her will. While those who testified on Glanville's behalf claimed that Forrest had been a disobedient child who kept idle company and spent extravagant sums of her money. And her disinherited children filed quite a number of suits against her, both in her lifetime and after her death. I'm still working my way through them, but right now I'm working on the largest of these cases, Forrest Ashfield versus Henry Goodricke, filed in 1709, which was after her death, right? So she had already died by this point. In this case, Forrest, her son, claimed that his mother was mad, not a woman in her right mind, when she wrote her will. And amongst the many instances that he cited as evidence of her madness, he included her study of butterflies. Now, that pursuing butterflies was evidence of madness prompts questions about popular notions of gender lunacy and of scientific activity, natural history, and entomology more generally. It's really easy from a 21st century and even a 20th century perspective to see this accusation of lunacy as a consequence of a woman contravening gender norms, right? Like, oh no, a woman in science, that sort of thing, right? And that's part of it to some degree. But I would argue that the picture is much, much more complex than that, because even really reputable male collectors faced similar public censure. And they were thought to be mad too, a little more offhandedly, but still, like that sentiment was still prevalent in the period. For example, one of Pettifer's male correspondents, an envoy in Spain, complained in a letter, "I have been suspected a madman by some who observed me following butterflies, picking of herbs and other lawful exercises, and I have had much to do to escape the censure of higher powers." In both Glanville's court case and in popular literature, we find that insect collecting, and more specifically chasing butterflies, was a convenient and powerful metaphor for a host of one's social and moral ills, including capriciousness, folly, whimsy, and fancies, all of which were adjacent or tied to madness. Throughout the court case, Glanville's son Forrest and the testators on his side painted a picture of Eleanor Glanville as a woman so captivated by her whims and fancies that she neglected her children, estate, and her tenants. But above all, according to them, Glanville changed her mind constantly. And so the reasoning went she couldn't have possibly meant her will to stand. Before I relate some of the alleged colorful instances of Glanville's madness, I want to put out a disclaimer, right? We don't really know, and we can't really know how true any of these stories about Glanville are. I'm not saying that they're outright lies or fabrications, right? But they're definitely embellished. There's definitely a lot of examples where embellishment is pretty clear. They're extremely one-sided. Glanville was not there to defend herself. They're often personally and financially motivated, and shaped by a number of other external factors. So take the stories that follow with and the characterizations of Glanville with kind of a grain of salt, right? So Forrest, her son, narrates his upbringing in a kind of picaresque fashion, describing his failings as a farmer, his wanderings to Flanders to become a monk, his attempts to become a prosperous merchant in the Caribbean, and his time as captive to French pirates. I mean, it really reads like some kind of picaresque novel from the period, right? But all of his miseries and destitution, he explains in the court case, were caused by the whims of his capricious mother, that she changed her mind constantly, inexplicably, suddenly overtaken by a whim to have him be a merchant, a scholar, a farmer, etc., before changing her mind again. And Glanville's tenants, she had quite a number of tenants, related similar stories that hinged on Glanville's whims and fancies. That she managed her estate poorly, inexplicably letting lands laid to ruin. That she'd often order services from a parish mason or carpenter, give unintelligible instructions, and then change her mind. And they also complained about her incessant moving about, that she couldn't stay in one place for a long time, that she restlessly moved between her home at Tickenham to Bristol and to London. And throughout the depositions made on the part of Forrest Ashfield, all the deponents ascribed to Glanville a set of closely related adjectives that they say characterized her actions: whimsical, fanciful, freakish, frantic, and maggoty, right? And there's actually one example from John Picot, one of her neighbors, and he says that she had several times played frantic tricks and dealt and delighted much in butterflies, spiders, and worms, and had many such like unaccountable whims and fancies, and that by her ways and dealings, she was not a sensible woman and was very maggoty. And this language recurs across the testimonies, right? This set of interrelated words. I think we have a fair idea of what whimsical means, right? Someone full of whims. But I want to take some time to unpack some of these associations bundled up in this set of words. The descriptor maggoty stands out. It's a term whose meaning has fallen out of use, but also because Glanville actually collected maggots and other worms. And so I was really confused when I first read this. Maggoty, what are they talking about, right? But the more I investigated, the more I found that maggoty was actually a descriptor for someone who was mad or crack-brained. And so during this period in the late 17th century and early 18th, the adjective maggoty and the noun maggot came to denote a whimsical and freakish person, the implication being that his or her brain had decayed into madness and sprouted maggots, right? So like a decaying piece of flesh that sprouts maggots. And one contemporary source defines maggot as a whimsical fellow full of strange fancies and capriccios, maggoty, freakish. Capriccio here is the Italian word for capriccio, meaning a sudden, sportive, or fantastic motion, a prank, a trick, a caper, from which we derive our own English word caprice, meaning a sudden change or turn of mind without apparent or adequate motive, a desire or opinion arbitrarily or fantastically informed, a freak, a whim, a mere fancy. Now, related to the late 17th century definition of maggots, although not directly used in this court case, is the term butterfly, which during this period actually, in addition to meaning butterfly, also came to denote a capricious, giddy, or frivolous person. And in fact, Glanville is, at least, if not outright named, she's described as such, as someone who might be found singing or dancing in an inexplicably jovial mood, but as someone who might just as suddenly fly into a fit of rage, right? So it's this kind of change that they're really emphasizing in the testimonies. And so her butterfly collecting, her pursuit of butterflies, I argue, is evidence of madness, not simply because she was a woman violating gender norms. Rather, I argue that pursuing butterflies specifically was viewed as a physical manifestation, a kind of symptom of these interlinked character traits of whimsical, freakish, frantic, capricious, and maggoty. Popular motifs of butterfly chasing in literature, I'm finding do support this argument. And I'll just name one really powerful example published here in 1710 in the Tatler, which was a satirical newspaper. The article titled Letter from Lady Gimcrack relates the untimely death of her husband, Sir Gimcrack. And the letter is worth quoting at length and reads as follows. Upon Midsummer Day last, as he was walking with me in the fields, he saw a very odd-colored butterfly just before us. I observed that he immediately changed color, like a man that is surprised with a piece of good luck. And telling me that it was what he had looked for above these 12 years, he threw off his coat and followed it. I lost sight of them both in less than a quarter of an hour, but my husband continued the chase over hedge and ditch until about sunset, at which time, as I was afterwards told, he caught the butterfly as she rested herself upon a cabbage near 5 miles from the place where he first put her up. He was here lifted from the ground by some passengers in a very fainting condition and brought home to me about midnight. His violent exercise threw him into a fever and at last carried him off. So I would argue that madness here, although not explicitly named, is implied by this sort of sudden frenzy that overtakes Sir Gimcrack. Again, this is entirely fictional, but he's so overtaken with curiosity, with this whim, that he experiences a sudden bodily change and embarks on a seemingly uncontrollable chase, to the point where he literally runs himself to death pursuing this butterfly. It is his downfall, right? Again, this is entirely fictional, but I think it speaks to the kind of associations that many people had towards butterfly collecting. And I've found other instances of similar stories of men chasing a butterfly in hot pursuit for miles, near to the point of death, sometimes even tackled by an onlooker who was concerned for him because they thought him mad, right? I'm still in the process of researching this motif of chasing butterflies and all its attendant associations, but I can say from what I've seen so far that pursuing butterflies functioned in the satires and anecdotes that I've seen, and in Glanville's court case, as kind of an emblem for certain qualities that increasingly came to be seen as negative, including whimsy, caprice, and frenzy. And it indicates that although butterfly collecting was a popular activity and a socially acceptable one among elite circles, it was not unilaterally appreciated or even accepted, regardless of gender, right? And so in Glanville's case, because she was a woman, and that is important here, she was even more vulnerable to social approbation and disapproval for pursuing butterflies. But again, her gender doesn't really explain the entire picture. Really, what Forrest, her son, and the testators were trying to prove when they cited her butterfly collecting was that she was a whimsical and capricious person whose actions could not be trusted. So it tied to a kind of range of other activities, right? And personal character traits that they ascribed to Glanville. It's important to keep in mind that when Glanville studied butterflies, there was no such thing as a distinct discipline of entomology. It's not an established discipline or field, rather it was subsumed under the umbrella of natural history. And many people who did collect insects also collected fossils and plants and all manners of natural curiosities. Only in the 1760s does the word entomology even enter the English language. Of course, as the activities of Glanville, Pettifer, and other collectors attest, studying insects was nothing new in the late 18th century. And so decades down the line, when entomology did become a distinct discipline, entomologists of old shared stories of the days when their kind were thought odd. And the story of Eleanor Glanville and her alleged madness circulated amongst descendant communities of entomologists. In 1766, one of these entomologists, Moses Harris, recorded briefly Eleanor Glanville's story in his book, The Aurelian, or Natural History of English Insects. He writes of the Glanville fritillary, this fly took its name from the ingenious Lady Glanville, whose memory had liked to have suffered for her curiosity. Some relations that were disappointed by her will attempted to set it aside by the acts of lunacy, for they suggested that none but those who were deprived of their senses would go in pursuit of butterflies. He goes on to say that John Ray and Sir Hans Sloane, two of the most famous naturalists of their days, testified to the lady's laudable inquiry into the wonderful works of creation at the trial. Now, I've looked at this trial and I've found no evidence that corroborates this. It's unlikely and actually impossible for John Ray to have testified because he was dead for a number of years by the time of the trial. But nevertheless, the factual inaccuracies alone, the kind of legend quality that Glanville's story took on in this period demonstrates that Glanville's story had been told over and over again, passed down through the generations, cited as evidence of the prejudices that early entomologists face in their pursuit of butterflies. Today, Glanville's legacy lives on in a butterfly by her name, right? But also in this institute with its commitment to diversity and inclusion. Glanville was a woman entomologist during a time when it wasn't exactly easy to be a woman, and it wasn't exactly easy to be an entomologist either. And by entomologist, I mean someone who studied insects almost exclusively. Glanville utilized her location in the Somerset Levels and near the port city of Bristol to collect local and Atlantic specimens. She relied on her wealth, her social status, and her legal status as a femme sole to collect, study, and correspond about butterflies. In the process, she became something of a curiosity herself. We might think back to the William Vernon quote about her putting other naturalists to shame, and the kind of marveling tone that he expressed when he mentioned her. But to her closest family members, neighbors, and tenants, the people that she lived near and spent her day-to-day life, she became literally a maggot, a whimsical person whose eccentricity bled over into madness. The madness component of her story, however, should not overshadow her contributions to the making of modern entomology. And I'll end with saying that part of her contributions include discoveries like the Lincolnshire fritillary and other insects. But really, the most significant contribution she made was the path that she forged as an early woman entomologist during this transformative period for natural history, just before the Enlightenment, when recreational entomology and botany would become encouraged activities for women. So thank you all for attending this lecture. I hope that you learned something new about Eleanor Glanville's life and legacy. I also want to credit the following institutions for supporting and funding my research. And yeah, so thank you. I look forward to hearing all of your questions.
Thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful talk. I've been asked to field some questions. Belinda, did you want to say something first before we move to questions?
Oh, yeah, sorry, trying to find my buttons. That was amazing, Michelle. Thanks ever so much. No, we named the institute after Eleanor Glanville, number of years ago, we started out as a gender centre. So we were very interested. We tried to find an early female scientist that had some link to Lincolnshire. So we ended up with Eleanor. We didn't really know much about her other than she was, I think, called the first lady of entomology in Britain, I think. But absolutely fascinating. So thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Belinda. I guess I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'm trying to see how we can do this. We had a few in the chat. There was one by me in the chat, but if anybody would like, I guess they can, I don't know, raise their hand, or I don't know how this is going to work, and let me know if you'd like to have a question, or just Lucy. You have a question, I see.
Hello, Michelle. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
And there we are. I think you see me as well. There we go. Hello. I'm a literary specialist, Michelle. So I'm going to be coming totally off field here with my question. But as you were talking, and thank you. I mean, your talk was so fascinating, really engaging, really gripping. I loved it. So thank you so much for that. What kept coming back to my mind were two people as you were talking, both, well, one's a Victorianist, one straddles, yeah, they're both really Victorianist, one just peeps into the 20th century. Beatrix Potter and Edward Lear. And Beatrix Potter, as people may or may not know, was a real expert on fungi, and really, although she's known to us as a writer of children's stories, you know, she was an expert who made a discovery about the way in which fungi reproduce, and because she was a woman, was not allowed access to the Linnaean Society, where she would have been able to present her findings, and so she had to allow a male friend to go and speak on her behalf. And of course, what she put forward was poo-pooed, because, you know, the men there just sort of laughed at it, and many years later they discovered she had been right. But of course, she's another woman who excels in such a number of fields, and ends up, I think, also among those things, being the person who brings to the fore the breed of Herdwick sheep in the Lake District. She becomes a sheep farmer. She does an enormous number of really amazing things. And I can't help but wonder if women like Beatrix Potter probably at some level were spurred on by Eleanor Glanville as a forebear. But I was also struck when you talked about the fact that some men were also mocked for being butterfly collectors. It made me think about Edward Lear, because Edward Lear, of course, was also an amateur zoologist, and in the past I've thought about comparing Potter and Lear because they're so similar in many different ways, and that he ends up having a species of parrot named after him. He's often called upon as an expert on ornithology, particularly exotic ornithology, and he is also, of course, a naturalist painter of some repute, and he's benefits by patronage to a number of rich people across Europe. But also, to us, he's known primarily as a writer of nonsense verse. And it struck me as interesting that something about the way in which you're talking about butterflies as somehow becoming a way of rendering in metaphor a sort of whimsical or flighty behavior, somehow attaches itself to these other people too. And it's partly a gender thing, but also I would say about Lear, what's interesting about him is that various other oddities in his biography become attached to his predilection for these kind of things. And so, for example, it's mentioned that he's the 20th of 21 children. The fact that his father goes bust when he's 5 and they have to move to, you know, suddenly biographical oddities attract themselves to these kind of really fascinating people. And I suppose it's not a question, it's a sort of cathartic sort of outpouring. But all the time you were talking about Eleanor Glanville, these kind of people kept coming into my mind. And I was just thinking there's a historical kind of precedence and maybe tradition of these really fascinating people being put down by establishment people who perhaps lack what's really intellectual curiosity. There you are. I've laid that all out for you and do what you okay.
No, I mean, that's really well, thank you for that. I mean, I learned a lot from what you just said. You know, I'm familiar with Beatrix Potter, but I'm not so familiar with the Lear person that you mentioned. But it is really interesting to see kind of the continuation of kind of popular perceptions of people interested in this kind of science, especially the kind of like biological sciences that are maybe, you know, some people think like, oh no, insects, like why would you want to study that? Or, you know, rotting flesh with maggots, that sort of thing. Kind of there's a sort of like squeamishness towards it. And in my conversations with entomologists today, they've actually it has resonated, the story has resonated with them a little bit as well. Kind of like the wacky collector, right? So it is a trope.
Well, if you don't know Lear, you will know The Owl and the Pussycat, which is the thing he writes that is best known. But also, I should say that he produces a number of things like nonsense alphabets, but he also does nonsense collections of beings. So I'm sure insects is on his list. I'm sure you could find a sort of taxonomy of nonsense insects that he used. And I'm sure he'd be a fascinating person for you to think about. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting because, well, his colleague Lister actually wrote a very serious medical text because he said him studying slugs and mollusks was causing people to wonder if he was a very good doctor. So he actually had to prove that I am actually a doctor and I can write things, but now I hope they leave me in peace so I can get back to studying my slugs. So anyway, Dominic, you had a question.
I think Patricia and Joel were first.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Patricia, would you like to come
Okay, well, I'm rather tempted to do a cathartic outpouring as well, but I just sort of restrict myself for the moment to one point. I think there's a resurgence of interest in butterflies in this country and around the world because they're an indicator of environmental change. And I think I mean, this is just a suggestion. It's a way of making your research extremely relevant because Glanville fritillaries, as I understand it from my friend, the zoology museum curator, the Glanville fritillary is a prime example of a species of butterfly that's going extinct because the climatic changes that have been introduced. And so that sort of angle might give you a whole sort of opening into a different aspect onto your research and also make Eleanor Glanville much more relevant. I mean, she's got the double thing. She's a woman and it's she's linked with climatic change as well. So, and as I understand it, she's there's only one British species that is named after a British person, and that's Glanville's fritillary.
So my understanding is that there's two. There's
right.
another.
Okay, well, I read somewhere, probably Wikipedia or something, but I read somewhere that there was only one. I mean, you know vastly more about. Oh, by the way, I should have started that comment by saying I thought your lecture was wonderful, and I really, really enjoyed it and learnt so much, and especially all the metaphors of what it means to be a butterfly, which were really important right through the 18th century, and also in the Vanitas tradition of Dutch painting. Butterflies are like bubbles. They indicate transience. If you've got a bunch of flowers and there's butterflies on it, that indicates that they're only going to last for a day because butterflies are so short-lived. So there's a bit of catharsis. But anyway, the main point I wanted to make was about the environmental link, which might sort of open up a rather different avenue for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the suggestion.
Okay. We have Joachim. Would you like to answer the question, please?
Oh, thank you for the presentation.
It was very interesting. I just have a question that at a certain point you mentioned that Glanville was actually Catholic. It's the first time I've ever heard that. And it's, I don't know if I misunderstood, it was one of the reasons that her son was suing her. But, like, this seems like a big thing, actually, because she lived before the Catholic Emancipation Act. So there was a series of limitations to actually what she could do and kind of social cycles she could be part of. So I'm not sure if, well, I guess you didn't have time to mention everything, of course, but I found that detail very interesting. The first time I've heard it. And there's another thing that probably makes no sense whatsoever, but you mentioned that one of the things she was accused of was to leave some of her properties, I get like agricultural fields abandoned, I guess they were left fallow. And this is the long shot, maybe it doesn't make sense, but was this done so that more insects and butterflies could live there? But I don't know, this might be, a bit too much, reading too much into what have been something else, but I find it interesting, actually. But thank you for the presentation.
No, oh gosh, oh, I'm so happy. I'm getting so many good ideas from this Q&A. First, your question about the Catholic Emancipation Act and Glanville being Catholic. Yes, she was Catholic. We're not exactly sure when she became Catholic. Her father served Cromwell during the English Civil Wars, right? But at least during the Glorious Revolution, she was Catholic. Because I've actually read about, people taking her arms and her horses during the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So she was Catholic, at least as early as that. And that's something that I've actually been really interested in pursuing more in terms of entomology. And I really didn't talk about, you're right, I couldn't cover everything. But the idea of insect metamorphosis really actually does speak to religion, right? It has a really it raises really intense theological questions about the transmigration of souls. So as insects go through different life stages, what happens to their souls? Like, that's assuming that they have souls, right? But there is kind of this really interesting overlap between entomology and religion, and in that way, that's kind of the direction that I've been taking my research. But you're right, that as a Catholic, she would have been limited in some ways in the social circles that she operated. To your second question about letting the lands lay fallow, I'm actually finding that, in addition to letting lands lay fallow, that her tenants accuse her of doing other sort of wacky things, like diverting rivers, or like attaching a mill to her house in a really inexplicable location, or trying to like ride a bull. Like there's all these really kind of seemingly crazy examples, but then if you look at like the Royal Society transactions, they kind of seem just as out there too, so I'm actually finding that some of the choices that she made that were perceived as signs of madness, might have actually just been her projecting or her kind of like experimenting with different things. So that's a really useful insight though, to think about why she might have let lands lay fallow.
Yeah, that's interesting. As an editor of one of the Royal Society journals, I can tell you I still get wacky ideas coming my way. Anyway, Dominic, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. That was fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to read more about Glanville and now as well. And I have one addition to the kind of story of entomologists being derided. Well into the 19th century, the early British entomologists of the early 19th century, William Kirby and William Spence, opened their introduction to entomology with the words that people consider entomology as something futile and childish, and they're writing against it. So this kind of trope of entomology being a pursuit that is not actually acknowledged as much kind of carries on well into the 19th century, when at the same time it needs lots of people to actually engage in the. I mean, if you have a family or a class of organisms that is so diverse and abundant, you need more than you need a lot of people to actually pursue that kind of science, if you will. So so that's again, what I just wanted to say is that there's a variety of ways in which entomology is seen, and I think that's makes it so interesting, because it's both derided but also celebrated. And the same is with the kind of depiction of insects as well. The butterfly being the metaphor for the soul in Christian art as well. I mean, this is another kind of story. And then also the beauty of these cabinets and so on. This is just a little comment, and that's how these kind of long stories of entomology are actually quite important. My question would also be kind of related to her role in the kind of circles that she moved in. And do you have any evidence that she actually was a patron, actually like supporting people like Petiver, like with money or with some other means as well? And I have 3 or 4 other questions, but I will kind of just ask that one. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to kind of see the trajectory into the 19th century. There's definitely some letters I've read where people who study insects talk about kind of, how small and insignificant they might seem, but how they kind of speak to God's larger creation, that even God attends to insects, no matter how small. So, sorry, remind me again, what was your second question exactly?
If she acted as a patron, if she
Patron, yes,
supported
sorry. So I haven't found evidence of that in terms of supporting money. She did have some of Petiver's catalogs, which means that she would have had to have subscribed, or maybe somebody gave them to her. I know that she actually told Petiver, no, you don't need to send them to me. Like, I have them already, right? So it's possible that she subscribed to his catalogs, but there's no plates dedicated to her in the time period. My sense is, though, that she did support other women specifically interested in butterfly collecting, right? So there's that gentlewoman that was going to Virginia that she asked to collect on her behalf. And so it does seem that, by looking at Eleanor Glanville, we kind of get a window into more women's participation in that way, right? So relying on female networks to collect. So that's kind of my sense, but in terms of financial patronage, I haven't really found much evidence for that.
Okay, thank you. Sherilyn, you had a question?
Yes. First of all, it was a wonderful presentation. I guess my question is along the lines of this mystery that you presented us with. Who won the lawsuits?
So yeah, I guess I didn't get to that. Her son. So there were a couple of cases. The 1709 one, actually the judge determined it inconclusive and passed it along to the Aziz's court. Not sure how to pronounce it, to be honest. But and I actually haven't been able to locate that case, but according to secondary sources, her son won, and he sold off and broke up a good portion of her estate.
That's unfortunate.
I know. Yeah.
But I would also just mention too, I teach entomology. I take my students out on our campus, and when they're out there with their nets, yeah, people look at us like we're crazy. So, it still persists in 2023.
The legacy of Glanville lives on, doesn't it, Michelle?
Indeed.
Okay, we have one more question from Brad Scott.
Hi, Michelle. Nice to see you again. So a few little points. So following on the thing about the madness, I'm a botanist and a bit of a historian too, and I was reminded of the fact that in the period, quite a lot of people who go looking for mosses sort of slightly derided, maybe in a sort of jocular way, in a sort of self-mocking way, if you like, as you know, Buddle was called the king of the moss croppers, and you often see them in the letters, you know, I'm going a moss cropping. So I don't know if this sort of treatment of the frivolousness or the sort of weirdness of some of these natural history activities was solely limited to the small animals, but maybe also to the small plants as well, perhaps. And I was just wondering too about you mentioned about her recognizing 100 butterflies. But to what extent was there any sense of what we now know as sexual dimorphism in butterflies, of the difference between the males and the females? Did she know that, or did she treat them as distinct species?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I'm so happy that you came. Thank you for coming. Brad actually kind of, I don't know, hosted, we chatted a lot when I visited the Natural History Museum of London this past summer. So thanks, Brad, for coming. So as to the frivolousness of moss collecting, I haven't really come across that so much. This is kind of just a hunch, but it seems to me, because natural history, a lot of natural history in the period collected all different kinds of curiosities, right? A little more encyclopedic, right? And less specialized. And I'm kind of getting the sense that people who only focused on one thing, this is just a hunch, I might be wrong about this, but there's kind of this sense, like, especially like just because Glanville focused on butterflies, that was seemingly strange. It's almost like the other things that are a little more common, like studying plants, it's that kind of like holds it at center. I don't know, that's just a hunch. I don't know how true that is. I'm still like researching, but as for moss cropping specifically, I haven't found anything to that nature. And the sexual dimorphism, yes, actually, in that list of observations that I showed, she actually, one of the first numbers that she has, she writes that she initially thought that these two specimens were, let me see if I remember it correctly. These two specimens were one and the same species, but she eventually figured out that, no, they're actually the same species, just different sexes. So there was a sense of sexual dimorphism in the period. And to look at, to figure that out, she also would have had to have a microscope as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one question and then we'll wrap up because I've been waiting patiently. I get a suggestion actually. When you talk about the different life stages of insects, I know that Godard in some cases confused them with parasitism of like gall wasps and things like that.
Oh, okay.
So when you're talking about your idea of the soul and its, the transmutation of the soul, there was also debate at this time about insect parasitism in that same way, and it does impinge on life cycles of insects. So it's just a suggestion. It's not a question, but that's it. I want to thank you so very much for coming and speaking to us. We really enjoyed your talk enormously, and now we all know hopefully a little bit more about Eleanor Glanville and her significance. And so it was a really wonderful talk. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to give us, Michelle, before we wrap up the proceedings?
No, I guess I just want to thank everyone for listening to the lecture and having such really, really useful suggestions for further research, and really also for the audience for like encouraging me to think differently about some of the information that I presented. So yeah, thank you so much. It's always so exciting as an American to talk to English entomologists and people that kind of have more of a stake in my research. So I really appreciate it.
We really appreciated your talk, Michelle. Thank you for everybody to coming. Thank you, Belinda, for agreeing to my idea when I was like, this is I'm glad, Bill. So it turned out really well, and thanks to the audience, and most of all, thank you, Michelle. And I hope that you all have an absolutely lovely evening or rest of your day in the case of Michelle. Right. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.